Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dirk Schoenmaker, Professor of Finance at the Erasmus University. I'm your host today. Yesterday, we had the starting session with Christian Collier, my colleague. He's running the CEPR Research and Policy Network on Climate Change. I'm doing the one on sustainable finance. Yesterday, we looked at the financial risk and opportunities from climate change. And the short summary is, if you look at the different sectors, especially at utilities, a lot of dynamics. And secondly, responsible investors can do more on the voting than you expect. There was a nice model on that. So that's the opening gambit. Today, we go one step further and we really go into the supply chain. So it's not only what the company is doing itself, but what is happening in the supply chain, both upstream, but also downstream, the emissions from the cars which you are producing. And that's an extremely difficult topic, because then you need to attribute emissions in the supply chain. But it is very much needed if we want to take responsibility for emissions. And investors can only steer on it. Company executives can only steer on it once you have good information. And the good news is we have today Karthik Ramanna, and he will really show you how to do rigorous accounting of it. That's the first paper. And the second paper is the food sector, where there's huge supply chains, both from farm to fork. Yeah, so from farm to the, like Nestlé, Karen is from Nestlé, and then to the consumer. Also a huge supply chain. And it's not only climate change, but also biodiversity impact, which is the next big topic coming. But today we still do climate change. So what we do is, Karthik will open the floor for 20 minutes with his slides, and then we will have a discussion. And please put your questions in the Q&A so we can use them. So the floor is over to Karthik, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dirk, for that introduction and for having me here. And I'm delighted to be able to share with this group more on this topic of decarbonizing supply chains through rigorous GHG accounting. And what I will do is just offer you a sense of where we are right now. What is the current state of the art of supply chain accounting for greenhouse gases, which is, I will point out, sort of woefully inadequate for the seriousness of the climate challenge. And then perhaps say a little more about how we might be able to address it. And the good news, of course, I think is that actually the solution is well within sight. We can have very rigorous greenhouse gas accounting based on existing technologies and also at reasonably low cost, because the solution would run on the existing infrastructure of financial reporting and auditing. So by way of background, I'm a professor of business and public policy at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government. And prior to that, I taught at Harvard Business School, and I've trained as an economist at MIT. My co-author on this project is Robert Kaplan, who is a professor at Harvard Business School and a longstanding professor of accounting there. And we taught core accounting at Harvard Business School about 15 years ago together, which is how we got to know each other. And then we actually didn't have the chance to work on anything together until January of this year, when I was invited to be a discussant at a paper on carbon accounting. And I was actually quite concerned that what was being represented as state of the art in the space of carbon accounting was actually, much further behind than where it could be. And so my discussion was perhaps somewhat, sharp to that end. And Bob was in the audience, and he said, well, we should write this up into a paper. And so this gave us a chance to put this particular draft, and it has since been published in the Harvard Business Review. So in the November-December edition of the Harvard Business Review. So by academic standards, it was very, very quick turnaround, because we conceived the idea in March and put our first draft out in June, and we were able to get HBR to accept it within 1 month and publish it 2 months later. So we're thrilled, and we hope that this the speed of progress on this reflects, in some sense, the nature of the challenge before us, which is, we argue, imminently solvable. So where we are currently with GHG accounting is we have a lot of corporate disclosure on supply chain emissions, but these are effectively happening in glossy PDF documents that are called ESG reports. And this is actually not our work. This is the work of Ken Pucker in the previous edition of the Harvard Business Review, where he says, well, while there's been an explosion in CSR reporting or ESG reporting, it hasn't really had any impact measurably on global CO2 emissions, particularly in supply chains. So it raises the question whether the current accounting approach to ESG is really working. And actually, if you start to look at the accounting standard for ESG, and particularly for GHG, I won't talk about ESG more generally, I'll just talk about the GHG problem. If you look at accounting standards for GHG, it turns out about 95% of companies use a particular standard called the GHG protocol, or the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which was put together about 20 years ago by a group coming out of the World Bank and World Resources Institute, supported by BP and a few other oil companies. And they were, of course, well-meaning, and 20 years ago, this was state of the art and so forth. But interestingly, none of them were accountants by training. And so what the approach they used is something that most of us who've had any kind of accounting background or training would consider somewhat conceptually flawed. And this is, I think, where part of the problem lies. So the protocol basically aligns greenhouse gas activity or emissions into 3 scopes. And scope 1 is what's called direct GHG emissions. So these are emissions from sources that are owned and controlled by a company. So for instance, if your company has its own, say, power generation plant, or your company has a fleet of company vehicles or its own corporate jet, then hydrocarbons that are burned as part of sort of the direct operations, that's scope 1. And as you'd imagine, scope 1 for most companies in the economy is actually a very small part of their GHG footprint, because unless you're in sort of the energy business or the transportation business or the agriculture business or the mining business, you wouldn't really have large scope 1 emissions. Companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, banks, consulting companies, restaurants, et cetera, much of the economy in modern societies actually have a small scope 1 footprint. So that's why we have 2 additional categories, scope 2 and scope 3. And we can really understand scope 2 first by looking at scope 3. Scope 3 is really everything else that's not scope 1. It's basically everything that's upstream and downstream in your supply chain. And scope 2 is basically a small carve out of scope 3, which is basically emissions attributed to electricity purchased by the company. So imagine for a moment you're Apple and you're producing these iPhones. Well, then your scope 1 emissions are actually quite limited. Your scope 3 emissions is everything upstream and downstream from your supply chain. And your scope 2 is basically electricity you're using at corporate headquarters and the limited manufacturing facilities you have. So for a company like Apple or for a bank like, Bank of America, scope 3 is really where all the action is. The problem is that this scope 3 concept is just sort of effectively unmeasurable. And I'll just give you this example. So here, this is an example of a car door manufacturer. So the car door is at the center of the screen. And imagine you were making these car doors. Well, then you would have certain raw materials you'd need. Obviously sheet steel, you'd need glass, you'd need rubber, you'd need plastic and so forth, some electronics that'll go into the car door. So you've got lots and lots of suppliers. Let's say you've got hundreds, probably thousands of suppliers as a car door manufacturer. And of course, each of those suppliers in turn has thousands of suppliers as well. Any modern company today, very quickly, this becomes a problem of what we would call geometric complexity. It is conceptually impossible for a company to know all of its tier 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 suppliers. Maybe it'll know its tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. but it certainly won't be able to sort of know its tier 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 suppliers. And that means that any estimate that it puts out is basically guesswork. Scope 3 estimate is basically guesswork. And so that means that, of course, the Scope 3 numbers that are put out are effectively unauditable. They're unverifiable. And that creates a real problem. In fact, we haven't been able to find a single supply chain contract so far written on a Scope 3 number that's voluntarily supplied by a company. And that makes sense because, of course, when you look at how much guesstimation is going on in this, it's very, very hard to imagine these numbers are reliable. The other big problem from Scope 3 is that every company in the supply chain is expected to effectively repeat this process. So not only is the car door manufacturer guesstimating what is this GHG impact, the Scope 1 emissions, all the way upstream and all the way downstream, every other company in the supply chain is making the same estimates each time. So there's massive multiple counting going on. So to the extent that companies are being truthful in the way they're reporting on this, there's massive multiple counting going on. So you've got sort of a problem where the concept is effectively unmeasurable. It lends itself to gaming, and you get lots of multiple counting going on. So there's something really wrong with this Scope 3 approach, and we've got to fix it, which is really where we come in. And just again, this chart just gives you a quick sense of the scope of the problem. Basically what you have here is the ratio of supply chain emissions to direct emissions. This is from the Rocky Mountain Institute's report earlier this year. And you can see that really only for the fossil fuel industry is that ratio under 1. And that makes sense. For every other industry, the ratio is above 1. But on the average, for most industries, it's 5.5. And for industries like retail, hospitality, manufacturing, it's well over 5.5. So for the vast majority of the economy, figuring out this, basically what's going on in the supply chain relative to direct emissions, this is at the heart of the problem to solve. So how do we propose solving it? Well, we've developed something that's called ELiability accounting, and it's not complicated at all. In fact, we're sort of embarrassed by how simple it is, because the basic idea has been around in accounting for hundreds of years. We're saying that the conceptual flaw with supply chain accounting right now is that GHG is being measured at the entity level rather than at the product level. So what I mean by that is, as I said, remember I said earlier, companies are putting out ESG reports as PDF documents where they're trying to sort of estimate what is their GHG impact at a firm-wide basis. So, Nestlé or next speaker will put out an ESG report about its, greenhouse gas emissions at the level of Nestlé. Similarly, Shell will do that, Walmart will do that, Facebook will do that, et cetera. But of course, the market system doesn't work on the basis of entities. The market system works on the basis of transactions at the levels of products and services. And the whole innovation, the core innovation in accounting, the reason why accounting is such a powerful technique for accountability in a market system is that accounting operates at the product level rather than at the entity level. So our whole point is that if we want to fix greenhouse gas accounting, the GHG needs to be measured at the product level rather than at the entity level. So effectively, what we're saying is that when an output is sold from one company to the next in a supply chain, so imagine you're that car door manufacturer and you're buying sheet steel from a steel rolling mill, then there is actually a transaction that's happening on the balance sheet where the inventory of sheet steel is going from the balance sheet of the steel manufacturer to the balance sheet of the car door company. We're saying that when that inventory transaction happens, there should also be a corresponding transfer of ELiabilities, what we're calling the greenhouse gas liabilities, of the manufacturer of that sheet steel from the sheet steel company books to the car door company's books. And critically, that transfer doesn't happen in dollars or in monetary units, but happens in the units of greenhouse gas emissions. So units of CO2, CH4, et cetera. So what we're effectively calling for is that every step in the supply chain, just like you've got an inventory purchasing system that's saying, okay, I've got 5 units of sheet steel at this price per unit, at this quality of steel that's available in this amount of time. I can also add one more item, which is its greenhouse gas impact. And so if I have that, and I'm driving that at the per unit, at the product or service level, then just as those inventory transactions are happening on financial accounting books, a greenhouse gas transaction can happen on sort of what we're calling ELiability books. So if I don't know if the audience here is familiar with sort of basic financial reporting, but if you are, then you've seen what's called a T account, and a T account is basically at the heart of financial reporting. Now, of course, modern day computing software means that you don't actually have people making T accounts in journals, but this is, 200 years ago, certainly this is what was, or even not by 230 years ago, this is what was being doing. Now everything is on SAP or QuickBooks or that, but it's the same idea. And so basically we're saying at every stage of the supply chain, there are journal entries on e-accounting books that are involved at taking units of as inventory is moving from one side or from one site to another in a supply chain. There is a corresponding transfer of these ELiabilities of greenhouse gas emissions from one T account to another. And what this chart is showing you is simply the movement of those T accounts. Crucially, to make this system work, you need basically the equivalent of cost accounting. Cost accounting, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the term, is basically the art of taking overhead costs or joint costs. So for instance, the cost of CEO in a company is an overhead cost, and allocating it to products and services. So if you're manufacturing iPhones, you want to price your iPhone in a way that covers your costs, then you need what's called a cost accounting system that takes the cost of your CEO and your chief marketing officer and your advertising budget, et cetera, and drives it to your individual products and services so that you can sell these products and services without losing money. That's the field of cost accounting. And we're saying if the ELiability system works, basically it needs to do what cost accounting does. But cost accounting has been around for about 300-400 years now. So we're actually pretty good at doing these allocations. And this is just a worked out numerical example of how you would do it for a 2-product, 2-company, 2-gas. And so if you can show it for 2 products and 2 gases across 2 companies, then effectively you can expand it to N products, N companies, N gases. So this is just a worked out arithmetic example. I'll spare you the details. It's all in the Harvard Business Review sort of article that I mentioned. And similarly, just like you've got sort of an equivalent to cost accounting, you can get an equivalent to financial reporting on ELiability. So again, instead of reporting things in units of money, you would report things effectively in tons of CO2 emitted, or kilograms of CH4 emitted, or kilograms of N2O emitted. And basically what you're seeing here is like an opening liability account, adding in those ELiabilities directly produced through operations, as well as those acquired from suppliers, subtracting those that are transferred down the supply chain, just like an inventory transaction. So when you sell your car door to a car assembly company, you would transfer your ELiabilities out. So that would be that. And then it would give you a closing balance. And that gives you basically a change in ELiability. So this system allows you basically to get some equivalent of like a value-added tax or a value-added system of ELiabilities at each company in the supply chain. Critically, again, this system does not require any new massive investment in infrastructure because it would run on effectively the existing financial reporting and auditing system. And speaking of auditing, basically the technology to audit ELiabilities is effectively what the technology is today to audit accounts payable. And again, I'll spare you the technical details. It's in the paper, but you could imagine, for instance, an audit red flag being raised when ELiabilities that are being booked are unusually small relative to inventory peers for the scale of a particular financial inventory transaction. So that would allow you to get some flags there. Critically, you can use blockchains to track these scope 1 emissions across supply chains as a way to do a sort of a double check. The whole sort of purpose of the accounting system that makes it work so well is that you get these sort of double checks. And if you set up the scope 1 emissions in blockchains, you can prevent people from gaming the system, at least at a structural level. So this is just, again, I've given you a very quick tour of what we mean by the ELiability accounting system. The key advantages of it are that it avoids this multiple counting problem that we've talked about. That's the current bane of effectively GHG accounting, the so-called scope 3 accounting that we're talking about. And this system is effectively incentive compatible, which means that because just like when you're transferring inventories from one company to the next, the price of that inventory has to be negotiated in an arm's length transaction. Now, in addition to the price, you're negotiating the e-liability transfer. So if I'm a company that's trying to just like pack in all of the e-liability into a product and I sell it on to the next company in the supply chain, that company is going to be like, whoa, I don't want this e-liability on my books. So you've got to negotiate that down in a way that gives you basically an arm's length check, and it prevents you from gaming the system. Likewise, if you consistently undersell the amount of e-liabilities to your customers, your own e-liability balance will keep growing. And that can serve as basically your investors will look at it and say, wait a minute, you're constantly increasing your e-liabilities. You're not able to pass them on. It would be the equivalent of a company constantly increasing its debt and not able to pay it off. So there's this incentive compatibility that is built into the system. The system critically accommodates contributions. So if you're buying carbon offsets, et cetera, then to the extent that those are in fact verifiable, that's a whole different topic, then those contributions can be incorporated in it. It runs, as I've said, on the existing financial reporting and auditing system, so the compliance costs are actually quite low. Investors are used to doing the kind of analysis on cost of goods sold, payables, et cetera. So it would be the same kind of analytical tools that analysts use right now, financial analysts use right now, that could be applied to sort of studying companies based on their their GHG performance. And critically, this system can run on materiality standards that are completely independent of financial materiality, because you can define materiality at the level of GHG impact rather than, say, financial materiality, which is what current ESG standards mostly do. It doesn't require any government regulation, really, because you've already got like 200 of the largest companies in America signing a statement saying that they are going to sort of redefine corporate purpose and this and that. And they've already committed to saying they're going to do serious things on GHG. So if they're serious about it, we can just ask those 200 to get started on it. They're big companies. They're companies like Walmart and Amazon and Microsoft, and they have the power to drive this through their supply chains. And realistically, if even just those 200 companies and their supply chains were able to embrace this, we'd already be talking about 30–40% of the US economy. And that's enough actually to get other countries and other parts of the economy to run without any kind of COP negotiation or anything like this. This could be bottom up. But if governments do want to get involved, then this e-liability system basically provides you a basis, for a verifiable basis for all kinds of carbon taxation. You could have a VAT type taxation based on the value added in any company in a supply chain. You could have an end user, like a consumer facing sales tax. You could have a capital tax based on companies that have increasing balances of e-liabilities. We're taking no view on the tax point because in some sense that's outside of the remit of our paper. But we're saying that if you want to apply carbon taxes, you need a basis on which to apply them. And we would give you an auditable basis on which you can apply them. So what needs to happen for this system to work? Well, basically, we need ambitious companies that want to put their money where their mouth is, to first be basically pilot movers of this system. And we're talking to a bunch of companies right now to see if they will actually move on this and be pilot adopters of e-liability. At the same time, a number of ERP providers have expressed interest in this system because, of course, for them, they can make money by doing this. And it'd be great if we can get standard ERP software, whether it's SAP or others, to effectively include this in the purchasing sort of software and the inventory accounting software that's already out there. We want to get the SEC and the newly created ISSB here, in Europe, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which will replace the SASB and will be part of the IFRS Foundation. We want them to encourage companies to use e-liability. And quite frankly, if this system works, and there's no reason to believe it shouldn't, because like I said, it's based on at least 200 years of accounting best practice, then it can provide a rigorous blueprint for the S reporting. This is there's the E, the environment, the S, the social, and then there's G, which is governance, which is a whole different issue, which we won't talk about. But if you're thinking about S reporting on things like child labor, modern slavery, workplace harms, et cetera, the same principles can be applied to these. And you can imagine that when you buy a product like, say, an iPhone, You could get just like you go to a grocery store and you get a box of cereal off the shelf, and you see not just the price of the cereal box, but you also see the nutrition information, calories, etc. Every product or service in the economy can come with a price information. It can also come with a GHG or ELiability impact information, and it can come with information about, for instance, hours of child labor that were used to produce this product. There is definitely a non-zero amount of child labor used to produce this product. There's definitely a non-zero amount of modern slavery that is used to produce this product. That's just the nature of the economy. Now, it's absolutely reprehensible that this is happening. But the fact is, if you get really good accounting into the system that is auditable, then you can drive down these practices eventually to zero. I mean, you can't turn it overnight to zero, which is our point. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Dirk to moderate, and I'll stop the screen share.
Thanks, Karthik. And now we move to something completely different. The only thing the same is that we talk about the supply chain, about the chain, the value chain. But Karen, welcome. And if you can also put on your camera, then nice to meet you. So welcome to this presentation. You will do it from the food sector, and where the full supply chain from farm to fork, as you say, is really a very long one and a very complicated one. And I'm really looking forward to your presentation. You have 20 minutes.
Hi, so thank you so much for the opportunity to talk today. So yeah, I'm just going to share my screen, and let's see, I have two screens. So let's hope this one works. Yep, can you confirm? You can see my first slide?
It's visible, yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. So my name is Karen Cooper. I am worked now for Nestlé for 17 years, always in R&D. I'm actually a nutritionist by original training, but 10 years ago I got into sustainability, and it's a really nice mixture with nutrition because you talk about sustainable food systems, how to get everyone healthy diets within planetary boundaries. So it's a really nice combination of how can I say, career choices to bring these two together. So what I want to talk to you about today is what our climate change pledge is about, how we built our roadmap, and then give you a little insight into how we work in R&D against this climate pledge. So the main issue, and I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the food system side of climate, it didn't get too much of a showing at COP26. But basically, global food production is the single largest transgressor of planetary boundaries. And so if we don't look at the food system to fix climate change, then it's very unlikely that we'll meet our 1.5 degree target. Conversely, that also means it's one of the biggest opportunities that we have to look at this. And so it really does deserve plenty of airtime as an area to look at for climate change. When we take a slightly broader look than just climate, we take a look at the idea of the food system. So I'm also a food systems person, and so it's great to see the interconnectivity of all these issues. None of these are particularly standalone. So as you work as an industry, you can look at all the different levers that you can pull and see if there's different ways that you can work to make change happen. The first thing you need to do is decide to be a part of the change. That's a really important step up as a company and say, we want to be a part of this and make this difference really happen. There's an aspect around putting the value on food. So this is what we call a true costing. So it's something we've been part of in Nestlé for some years now, trying to do pilots and understanding what does it mean to have the true cost of food? You know, would it change your decision making if this was a part? There's been some great pilots on this. This picture's from a report in the UK where they said that for every pound spent on food, there is a shadow pound of food which is not being necessarily accounted for. So this is a particularly really interesting, rich area to look at. Of course, lower carbon products, that's rather an obvious one, but also care for nature and stop wasting what we get from nature. I think this is something that we don't talk enough about, and we'll start to see more of this going forwards. But also shifting the food environment. This is what the consumers see. So every time there is a message for a consumer, it should be congruent with a sustainable and healthy future. Consumers get a lot of mixed messages from lots of different places. So as much as possible, we can try and point the messages that they get towards the future that we need as well. I always slip in this care for farmers one because I think it's something that we don't get close enough to. I think we really have a chance to help consumers get closer to the people who actually grow the food for them. This is a picture from one of our projects that we run in Kenya, where we work with our farmers to help them understand how to build a healthy diet, how to grow a variety of foodstuffs for themselves, and what foods will help their children to grow up healthy and strong. It's one of my particularly favorite programs that we run. Supporting chefs to change. Chefs are amazing change makers. You know, they're really important to us as a way of helping to bring new ingredients to people, for instance. So not to be underestimated as a lever to pull. And then last but not least, of course, collaboration. None of this stuff can happen alone. We're all part of a very interconnected ecosystem. And so the more that we can work together, the better. This is from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development based in Geneva. I was actually seconded to them for 6 months. So it was a great chance to really help them build their food system work. So that's the big picture. So what does that mean when you drill it down to a single company? So we've recently been making certain pledges to help show our directionality to the outside world. So probably the most impactful one for me personally was when we made our net zero pledge. So in 2019, we made our net zero pledge. And so this means we will have to halve our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to get in line for our net zero by 2050. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that one as we go. We also have made an earlier pledge on plastics and recycling. All of our packaging should be reusable or recyclable by 2025. This one's coming up really fast. This one, it has a lot of technology sitting behind it. We have our new Packaging Institute, which was deliberately put in place to answer this pledge with technology and science. So that's been a really one that's moved us very, very strongly in R&D. In terms of water, water is always an interesting one. We've made a very recent pledge for regeneration of the water cycle. So this is the idea that everywhere we have a waters business, then we will work to improve the water cycle and to create a positive water impact. But our most recent one is more general on regeneration. So this is to advance regenerative food systems at scale. This is to bring a whole new lens to the work that we're doing and pull it together under the banner of regeneration. This idea that we don't have to just look at doing less harm, we can actually look to doing real positive change and making sure our products have the chance to bring positive change when a consumer chooses them. So this is around not just prevention of damage, but restoration and taking ourselves out to the other side of a beneficial food system. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the net zero pledge. So of course we see this as an important one, not just for the planet, but also for us. You know, if we want to continue as a company, we have to be on this trajectory for net zero. So the first thing we do, of course, when you make a pledge is know where you stand. You know, it's really important to do the data, to run the numbers. We brought in a third party to help us with this. We have actually been part of the Carbon Disclosure Project for quite some years. And so we have been disclosing, I think for over 5 years, our, I think even longer, our total footprint, Scope 1, 2, and 3. But this was the first chance to really dig in, to really get to a much better granularity than we've managed before. And for that, we needed some third party. The rules in this area are still evolving, still changing, so it's good to always have a third party to help out. And of course, this means that the entire life cycle of what we do as a company. We have a broader measurement, but the pledge, because so much of our emissions comes from Scope 3, we were allowed to take out certain things from our pledge where we have very little opportunity to actually change anything. So for instance, we were allowed to remove consumer use because we have very little opportunity to change what a consumer actually does in their home with our products. But that leaves us with still with 92 million tons of CO2 a year, based on a 2018 baseline. And as you can see, most of it comes from agriculture. And so this does drive our action plan, and hence the regenerative pledge has a strong focus on regenerative agriculture to help address this. So the actions, of course, need to span everywhere in order to be able to get system level change. We can't just focus on any one area. And so, of course, sourcing the ingredient sustainability is absolutely one of the most key areas. And we really have a big focus on dairy and livestock. Of course, dairy is one of our biggest single emitter ingredients. But of course, as I mentioned, the packaging, not only for the reusable and recyclable, but also for climate. Any change that we do for that also has to help us meet the climate pledge as well. Logistics, very important. Not the biggest area for us, but still very key that we look at that. Our brands as well are a chance for us to carry this message to consumers, a chance for them to understand what we're trying to do behind the scenes and talk through our brands on this. And carbon neutrality is a route to that. And of course, transforming our product portfolio. Our portfolio is what people see, the products are what people buy. And so it's really important that we bring this change through our product portfolio. In our factories, of course, moving towards renewable energy. And then, of course, looking at options to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we have a preference for natural climate solutions, and so wherever possible, trying to restore nature alongside sequestering carbon. And very last, of course, advocacy to try and bring that together. We had a strong presence at COP26. I think it was a really great way to learn what other people are doing and to also be able to be transparent about where we are as well. So I just wanted to give you a feel for one of the deep dive areas. I picked dairy because it's, as I mentioned, our biggest emitter. And so what we had to do was incorporate growth, our potential growth, and the carbon intensity of what we presumed that growth would be, and then work backwards from that and pick all the different levers. So all of this is public information. You can find this on our carbon roadmap. And this is the level of granularity that we had to get to be sure that we were going to be able to answer the changes that we needed to make by 2030. So all of these are numbers for 2030, and you can see the sort of the maths behind this and the work behind this was tremendous to be able to just put numbers on a page that we were happy with. But we know that we have to pull multiple levers for every single change. No one single thing is going to get us there. And so even just for dairy, you see here 7 major actions to get us closer to that particular goal. I mentioned carbon neutrality. Speaking with our brands and speaking as corporate, these are 2 things which take us towards the same goal, but have different terminology. And so you might see our brands talking about neutrality, which means the farm to fork, the entire life cycle, including consumer use. We are allowed to use offsetting with that, but we make sure our brands are on track to do reductions. They're not allowed to just do offsetting. They must do reductions before they're allowed to go on this journey. And then they must continue reducing as they go. There is no allowance here for just buying offsets and being able to go for carbon neutrality. For net zero, this is a different story. Again, the rules are
just a clarifying. Karen, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So you basically mean only nature-based offsets are allowed, not potential ones.
Our preference as a company is for nature-based, high-quality solutions.
Yeah.
And actually, we have a preference also for what we call insetting. So trying to do those in our value chains rather than a random project somewhere else. We want to be as close as possible to where we're working. And I think that makes a lot of sense, for us to keep that connectivity to it. Yeah. For the net zero target, we're not allowed to use any offsetting. And of course, our scope is predefined, as I mentioned before, with the 92 million tons. So there are different scopes, and so these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. I think it's important that we have a distinction between the two, because there can be some misunderstandings out there. So I just wanted to do a little bit of a run through about what it means for us in R&D. We work across the entire life cycle to try and make reductions and make changes. And what underpins all of this is the modeling of the impact. I say here carbon impact, but we try and go beyond just carbon to make sure we're not accidentally upsetting another indicator. And there are tools that we use to help us do that. So we first off will analyze our products. We'll use internal software to do this that we've developed with another company. We've been doing this for many years to help us understand where we need to act at a product level. And this helps us identify what levers we need to pull on a per product basis. But that's on a project where we're actually actively trying to make reductions. But we have many R&D projects, and not all of them have climate as a main goal. They're out there for other reasons, nutrition, for instance. And so we need to understand the impact of everything that we do in R&D. So every single one of our R&D projects are assessed for climate change. So this means we sit down with our experts and we go through the intention of the project and we understand what's going to come. And then we strive to make that project also deliver on climate if possible. So this has been a real interesting one for us to give us a lot of transparency internally as to what we're trying to achieve. We are a big fan of using tools that are agreed across the industry. The Cool Farm tool is a particular favorite of ours. This gets us onto farm level. We've been doing it on dairy, getting into our dairy chains, understanding our farms as much as possible at a farm archetype level. And this means we can make better decisions about what solutions we put on the ground in farms, because there's no one solution for all types of farms. A farmer in Pakistan with 2 cows versus a US farm with thousands, very different solutions that you would need to put into place. And then, of course, working with the external initiatives, the methods are, again, evolving fast. And so we need to be staying very close to those as R&D. So we work across. I'm just going to quickly run through without too much depth on this, but plant science is something that we've done for decades. We're very keen on trying to derive varieties through classical non-GMO breeding and harnessing the natural biodiversity that we have, specifically in coffee, to see if we can find varieties that will help us have higher yields and therefore need less inputs and have less climate impact on your final cup. Our newer area, though, is on dairy agriculture. This is relatively new for us. We've always done dairy generally in the company, but in R&D, to really get into the field, it's been a very exciting change for us. So we can really start to deep dive now on enteral fermentation, on emissions from manure. It's all very exciting new area for us to get into. A great chance to collaborate with experts and to look at new solutions that are out there. But what we're after, of course, is practical solutions for farmers, something that we can really help bring to bring those reductions as fast as possible. Recipe design is our heartland as R&D. Recipes are, of course, what we're here to do is to design new products, design new recipes. Of course, as I mentioned, the first thing we need to do is understand the impacts at a product level. But we can also use that to model changes. We can theoretically model different ingredients as part of that and understand if we're going to bring changes to both this, but also at the same time of nutrition. And we're always on the search for new low carbon ingredients and ones that will help us deliver on all the different axes of taste and affordability, for instance. You'll see a lot of our stuff has been on plant-based recently. And so we can bring in products which you recognize, such as a Kit Kat, but we can change out ingredients and switch them to vegan. So in this case, it was for a vegan Kit Kat. But also we can look at things like side streams. So these are byproducts of a normal agricultural process. And for instance, in Koa here, it was a chocolate where we took out the sugar. And then if you look at a cocoa pod, the white that's inside that sits around the pods, it's naturally quite sweet. And so we put that in instead of the sugar. And so it's a chance to make a chocolate solely from the cocoa pod. And so it's a real chance for innovation in this space. But what we're really after is our product developers to be sensitized for climate change. And so every time they're making a decision, they can go, I want to make things better for climate, and they'll make their choices accordingly. Process technologies is rather obvious, actually. I mean, we work a lot on our processes. We're always improving them for efficiency, to reduce waste, to make sure we have the best processes we do. But we need to make sure that they're ready for a fully renewable future. So we're developing processes that are electrified, for instance, are compatible with renewable energy. Packaging, I've already spoken something about this. This is where two pledges meet. So our recyclable and renewable pledge and our climate pledge need to come together, and we look for solutions that sweet spot between the two. And so eliminating non-virgin plastics, for instance, and we are increasing recycled content, using more monomaterials. Alternate delivery systems is another nice new area for us. And we're starting to see some nice changes in our outcomes. So we now at quite a high rate, so 87% of recyclable or reusable, and 35% of our materials are recycled. But the fun stuff for us in R&D is where we're trialing brand new things. So you see here a loop system. This is happening in France. So it's a fully returnable and washable container. So it is part of an ecosystem. They work with multiple companies. And the idea is if you can work at a certain amount of scale, then you can make systems like this work. And then, of course, paperization. We see a lot in paperization. And recently, we were able to turn an entire brand to paper, which was Smarties, the first one to go. And this has been a real technological challenge, but I think a very rewarding one for our packaging teams. And then lastly, brand new products. Okay, so we're also in the process of making brand new products. We don't just renovate our old ones. And we can take different routes for climate. One is to create an alternate to something that we already sell. So vegan versions of something. So vegan milk, or we see here the vegan carnation. It's one of our oldest brands, and people, are used to using this in cooking. We can make a vegan version for people, so they don't have to change their habits. They can easily find an alternate that's on the shelf that will do the job for them. We can explore brand new areas. We've had a lot of fun recently getting into the space of fish analogs. So Vuna is our vegan tuna. We have a brand new one that was only launched just a couple of weeks ago, which is a vegan shrimp, alongside our vegan egg. So these are all brand new innovations from our side. So it's been a really interesting time to get these out and onto the shelf. And then lastly, I mentioned side streams before, but it's not just about putting them into current products. We can also shape whole new products around a side stream. So this one, Cascara is the berry around coffee. So we use the coffee inside, of course, but the coffee berry, is often goes to waste. So can we use that? Can we put that into products? And this is a new drink that was launched in Australia from that. And then this one is a German product which uses rescued vegetables. So vegetables that were a little bit not quite ready for fresh selling, but we can use that. They're perfectly good for what we need. And we can make brand new products where we valorize ugly veg and things like this. So it's been a really, really, again, a nice way to explore a new area. But the final message I'd like to leave you with, though, is that for us that innovate, it is increasingly difficult to bring together all the axes of what we need to do in a final product. We need to tackle nutrition, sustainability, affordability, and taste. And all of this has to make a product that people actually want to buy in the end. So it is a challenge, but it is one that we are increasingly getting ready for and tackling. And we hope that as the system starts to change, we will start to see that these products are gaining acceptance, and it's getting easier as the system moves further forwards and makes it more amenable to us bringing new products to the market like this.
Well, Karl, thanks a lot for this great overview.